boasts an estimated 3.8 million acres of wetlands, with 95% of this acreage in the coastal region. So what makes these areas wetlands? Looking around, it's pretty easy to see why a salt marsh is called a wetland. However, some wetlands are harder to recognize at first glance. There is no one set scientific or legal definition of a wetland, but various definitions always reference hydrology and often reference soils and vegetation. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Delineation Manual identifies that there are 3 parameters to measure for wetland identification and delineation: hydrophytic vegetation, hydric soils, and hydrology. Notice, wetland characteristics can occur in areas of land that are any size. We'll start with hydrology, since wetlands have to involve water. The water can be fresh or salt and come from one or more sources, including precipitation, groundwater, runoff or overland flow, riverine flooding, and tidal inundation. Wetlands can have surface water or have saturated soils without surface water. The salt marsh is inundated twice daily by incoming saltwater from the ocean, an easy-to-recognize pattern of wetland hydrology. The salt marsh also receives freshwater runoff from the land following precipitation. The amount of surface water and soil saturation can vary greatly from day to day, season to season, or even year to year. But the area will still be a wetland, even if it often seems dry. The boundaries of wetlands cannot be determined by the presence or absence of water at any given time. Carolina bays receive water mostly from precipitation, which means this pattern of wetland hydrology can be harder to recognize. Carolina bays can go for long periods of time without surface water in drought conditions and appear pond-like during wet conditions. Some legal or regulatory wetland definitions require a certain amount of surface water or soil saturation for an area to be considered a wetland. For example, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Delineation Manual requires evidence of ongoing wetland conditions to satisfy their hydrology criteria. Wetlands tend to be wet, but that's not the complete picture of the unique features that define these habitats. All that water creates hydric soil. Hydric soil forms under conditions of saturation that are long enough to develop anaerobic conditions, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The salt marsh's hydric soil is easily recognized by sight, smell, and feel: pluff mud. Pluff mud is formally part of the Capers and Bohicket soil series, as defined by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and is described as very deep, very poorly drained, very slowly permeable soils. It is silty clay or clay and often very dark in color. Carolina bays typically have soils that are dark in color as well. The texture can vary from sandy loam to a silty clay loam. High levels of organic matter and peat are often present. The source of the water creating hydric soil doesn't matter. The hydrology of an area could even be artificially engineered to saturate a certain place, and the soil would still be hydric after sufficiently wet conditions. Conversely, if water has been artificially diverted away from a wetland, the soil is still considered hydric, as that was its unaltered state. This means that drained wetland areas will still have saturated soils if water returns to the area. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Delineation Manual looks for soils that exhibit characteristics that develop under permanent or periodic soil saturation to be considered markers of a wetland. Hydric soils support hydrophytic vegetation, or vegetation that tolerates prolonged inundation or soil saturation. Hydrophytic vegetation is fairly easy to learn to recognize. Smooth cordgrass, or Spartina alterniflora, is hydrophytic vegetation characteristic of the salt marsh. Blackrush, or Juncus romerianus, is also frequently found in South Carolina salt marshes. Marsh hammock islands and marsh edges are often home to eastern red cedar, sea oxeye daisy, and other plants that can tolerate periodic high levels of salt water, but not twice daily inundation. Carolina bays are home to some very special hydrophytic plants, like pitcher plants and sundews, which are both carnivorous. Other South Carolina freshwater wetlands often feature various species of ferns and trees that are specially adapted to life with wet roots. like these bald cypress along the Waccamaw River.
Your county or local government probably has its own definition of wetland, but it'll focus on one or more of these three components.